Well, hello and welcome everyone to CABE's Fact-Checking, the Science of Reading and Moving Beyond Mandates. This webinar is being put together by CABE, California Association for Bilingual Education. I am Dr. Edgar Lampkin. I am the CABE CEO. And again, this webinar will engage in a discussion with our speakers and our panelists. The webinar stems from the book, Fact-Checking, Science of Reading, Opening Up the Conversation. Moving beyond the mandates is a critical issue for CABE as it negatively impacts our English learners and emergent bilingual learners in education. Recently, legislation across the United States, and recently as well, an attempt in California, has brought the science of reading's methods and claims to question. Presenters are going to share the 10 claims of the science of reading in a simple, clear way and show how each claim is fact-checked using the science of reading and how it factually should be described. There will also be some discussion around the attempts to, from recent legislation and approaches to implementing science of reading in California. We invited Dr. Robert J. Tierney and Dr. David P. Pearson, who have fact-checked the science of reading and have a clear way to explain why science of reading must be fact-checked and how we should engage in the sciences of reading that are already encompassed in the comprehensive, research-based, and robust California English Language Arts and ELD English Language Development Framework that supports literacy and biliteracy. Before we get started, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you CABE's Director of Programs and Events, Delma Shulinsky Sheridan, who will give you some important information and direction for today. Delma, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lampkin. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping items for you. As we get started with this wonderful webinar, checking the fact-checking science of reading and moving beyond mandates. As this webinar gets started, you will note that the speaker and the panelists' microphones will be active and the participants' microphones will be muted. If you would like to pose a question, please use the question and answer QR code. Our speakers will be addressing these questions at a later date. We scheduled it for June 24th. It will be available for you at our Go CABE website. Remember, June 24th at our Go CABE website. You will have your questions addressed. We will be sharing that QR code with you shortly for the Q&A. And you would need to make sure that you click on that and you can answer, you can pose your questions there. Once again, there will not be any chat available for you to put questions in. So before we get started, I'm just going to share real quickly the Q&A questions. So you guys could click on it. For today's webinar. Now back to Dr. Lampkin.
Thank you, Delma. I would now like to introduce to all of you my fellow panelist, Dr. Barbara Flores. Dr. Barbara Flores is our CABE board member, currently serving as our immediate past president. She's also Professor Emerita at the University of San Bernardino, California. Our second panelist is Dr. Jill Kerper Mora. Dr. Mora is a renowned educator, author, and reading researcher, as well as a specialist for English learners and emergent bilingual learners.
Hello.
So, Dr. Flores?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lampkin. It is my honor today to introduce both Dr. Rob Tierney and Dr. P. David Pearson. Dr. Tierney views himself as a global educator and learner engaged in research related to literacy learning and other educational endeavors. He is Dean Emeritus and Professor Emeritus of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. He is also a distinguished professor at Beijing Normal University and an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, where he also served as Dean of the Faculty of Education and Social Work. Rob has served as an editor of the Reading Research Quarterly and is the immediate past president of the International Literacy Association Board of Directors, the past president of the Literacy Research Association, and the president of the Association of Canadian Deans of Education. His engagements extend across the globe, including Asia, Africa, and the Americas. His work is primarily focused on collaborations on global issues, especially pertaining to local epistemologies. His articles on literacy and global meaning making have appeared in key scholarly outlets. In 2021, Teachers College Press published Rob and David Pearson's co-authored book, A History of Literacy Education, Waves of Research and Practice. In 2022, Elsevier published the International Encyclopedia of Education, 4th edition, for which Dr. Tierney served as the lead editor. And currently in 2024, Rob and David undertook to publish the open access monograph, Fact-Checking the Science of Reading, Opening Up the Conversation, which is the topic of our webinar today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. P. David Pearson, who is the Evelyn Lois Corey Professor Emeritus in Instructional Science within the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley, where he served as Dean from 2001 to 2010 and Professor from 2001 to 2017. Founding editor of the Handbook of Reading Research, he has written over 300 publications with over 250 colleagues and students for teachers, researchers, and policymakers across 50 years. With degrees from UC Berkeley, a BA in history, and University of Minnesota with a PhD in education, his research focuses on reading instruction and assessment practices with special attention to disciplinary literacy and comprehension instruction. His agenda in retirement focuses on historical and policy-oriented essays about reading processes and pedagogy. And again, the most recent book that he co-authored with Dr. Tierney is Fact-Checking the Science of Reading. He has received many awards for his nearly 50 years of research and service in reading research, most notable the William S. Gray Citation of Merit by the International Reading Association, the Oscar Causi Award from the Literacy Research Association, the Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award from the American Education Research Association. He also has spent 19 years working on curriculum that integrates science and literacy with colleagues at the Lawrence Lab of Science. And lastly, he is a member of the National Academy of Education, the Reading Hall of Fame, and is an AER fellow. Thank you for coming today and sharing your expertise, and we welcome you. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Tierney, who will begin the webinar.
I hope you can see my screen. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you, Kabi, for inviting David and myself to present or talk to you today about our efforts to fact-check the science of reading. I'm going to start with asking the question, well, why did we do this? It's an interesting question. It actually stemmed from my watching a State of the Union address by Biden and then listening to a fact-checking episode after it, which I thought was really illuminating, particularly in this world that we live in right now. The reason for fact-checking the science of reading was the feeling like, wow, here we have a group of people postulating or making claims about what is the science of reading. And I became somewhat concerned with those claims, talked to David about it. And before we knew it, we started out writing an article that turned into a monograph of over 150 pages. We were concerned that we thought some of the interpretations of research were a little bit skewed. And one in particular was the extent to which they used the National Reading Panel report, claiming strong support for phonics, almost in a fashion that was somewhat exclusive. That was sort of concerning because we couldn't see in the National Reading Panel report something that was so untempered. Indeed, if you read the National Reading Panel report, you'll see statements like phonics should not become the dominant reading program. So we decided we should dig into this and find out what people are saying. So we read everything we could, from Marianne Wolf's stuff to Mark Seidenberg's stuff. And Mark had actually worked with David and myself at the Center for the Study of Reading many years ago. Marilyn Adams' work, Catherine Snow's work, and other people's work. So we read widely on this. And indeed, as a result of our own history in the field, we'd been exposed to the sorts of waves of development that related to this. We looked at the media blogs by a whole bunch of different people. We were really sort of troubled by some of the stuff that was appearing in the national presses, and dug into scholarly articles where they were exploring the science of reading, like the scholarly articles that appeared in the Reading Research Quarterly and other places that we thought were really interrogating these issues, including syntheses which involve meta-analysis of the science of reading that pertain to the issues that were being foregrounded or postulated as strong claims. As we dug into this, we basically explored or generated what we thought were the key claims. And with that, let me pass this over to David now.
Thanks so much, Rob. Can everyone hear me? I don't know how you would respond to it if you couldn't, but I want to make sure about that. Let's see if we can get this running here. Here we go. Okay, I just want to point out there's a QR code on this page. And in this QR code, what you will, if you download it, you'll get the chart that I'm about to share that is sort of our version of a lightning round of the claims in the science of reading. And we have three versions of the claim. One that is the headline version, what shows up in the media, like on Twitter or Facebook and the like. One is what shows up in books and journals, scholarly books and journals. And then the third version of the claim is one that we think, Rob and I think, is supportable by the science of reading. So we have the media, we have the scholarly work, and we have us as the three claims. And here's what it looks like. But by the way, I'll show that QR code again at the end of my part of this presentation. So here are the three versions, and we have one meta claim, and that is that the science is settled, and it implicates phonics as leading the way to better reading. That's the headline version. The scholarly version is there's a substantial body of evidence from basic and applied research to support widespread adoption of key practices, including phonics. And our sort of revisionist version of that is that, wait a minute, science is never settled. It changes with evidence and theory. It continues to unearth interactions, and it's best enacted as situated practice out there in the real world. So we take issue with that claim. Then I'm just going to briefly go over these claims as a kind of a preview, but I assure you that both the monograph that we have and the executive summary, which we've just finished and will make available to you after this webinar, go into these in great detail. The first is that phonics is is important and should be adopted as a uniform policy. Uh, if you look at the more scholarly versions, like the one that Rob showed you, it almost always in the literature says that phonics is a necessary, but never a sufficient condition for success. It should be embedded in a comprehensive reading curriculum in which phonics is one of many parts, and it can be taught in a variety of ways. We concur with the scholarly version of the claim, but when we look at what happens in state policies and mandates, we see phonics, but we don't see all the stuff that should surround phonics in a comprehensive curriculum. So we think we have a first amongst equals problems. Yes, do it all, but phonics first and fast. A second is that the simple view of reading, the view that says that comprehension equals decoding times listening comprehension, is facilitates our understanding and teaching of reading. The more scholarly version of it says, well, yeah, the simple view of reading is good, but it needs to be massaged and handled with some complexity. We, however, take issue with that. We think the science of the simple view of reading is a useful heuristic, but it fails to account for external social and cultural influences that shape reading. And as you can imagine, particularly when you're dealing with English learners, ignoring that part of the learning process can be fraught with concern. Recognizing words is the first order of business in learning to read. Well, yeah, sure, reading words is important, but what happens is that in the scholarly definitions of reading, they intentionally take out all the contextual and motivational stuff and say that reading is separate from literacy, and it's simply the ability to identify and understand words that are part of your oral language. Well, if you look at the recent developments in the science of learning and development, what's gone on in the last 30 years in research on learning, uh, uh, it's basically implicates a more contextualized social cultural definition of reading, which Rob will show you some of in just a little bit. The fourth claim, phonics is useful because it enables us to um, once we've unlocked a word enough times, pretty soon that word becomes recognizable as a sight word and we don't have to analyze it. That's true. The self-teaching attribute of decoding does facilitate that identification of these words that become immediately recognizable. But they're but that's not the only thing that does that. The systematic application of context clues and word solving when you're trying to unlock an unknown word can also contribute to that orthographic learning. 3-cueing system has been soundly discredited. I'm sure that our colleague Jill Moore will have more about this to say later on. But we were surprised at that because we couldn't find a lot of research that documents that directly. The more nuanced version of the claim is that cueing systems like meaning and syntax might support comprehension and monitoring, but are misleading when used for word recognition. Use them for verifying words once you've attempted to solve them. We thought that this failed to take into account an important body of research that shows that students who use all the cues develop a set for variability. There's some work by Donna Scanlon and her colleagues that says that kids that get multiple cueing approach to word identification and word solving outperform phonics only students. But Stephen, students who get a lot of emphasis on meaning cues, as they become more competent readers, do rely more and more on the orthographic cues on the printed page. It just happens as the natural end of things. Learning to read is an unnatural act. The idea is that children come wired to learn oral language, but they must be taught to read, to decode written into oral language. It is true that there is a language acquisition device that's pretty much accepted by linguists around the world for all languages. But to say that learning to read is unnatural, I think simply says that it's not wired like oral language is. But learning to read is as natural as learning anything else. it's all about kids being intrinsically wired to make sense of their world. And one of the things they make sense of is print and how it maps onto oral language so that you can make sense out of things. So we think that's just more of a metaphor that isn't really serves no useful purpose other than rhetorical. Seventh claim, balanced literacy and or whole language are to blame for the falling NAEP scores. You've seen newspaper articles about this. Uh, and the simple truth of the matter is that NAEP performance is shaped by such a multitude of educational, social, economic, and political factors. It makes it impossible and we think dangerous to attribute trends to any single factor. Neuroscience demonstrates that the pathway from orthographic learning to reading for meaning goes through phonics. And you heard a lot about this from Steve. Steve Strauss, if you listen to the previous CABE webinars. But we think, along with Steve and other colleagues, that the current accounts don't reflect the significant limitations of the fMRI findings and other counter evidence. But more importantly for us as educators, we think that extrapolating instructional practices from observations of basic brain science is a risky activity, likely to yield errors. If you want to know what works in the classroom, go into the classroom and do the research there and validate the practices there. If reading is recognizing and understanding words, then contextual factors have little role in reading. But we think this isn't consistent with the recent research in the science of learning and development, which implicate social, cultural, and contextual factors as key drivers of cognitive and biological learning. And we think that fails to take into account advances in the last 20 years. Final claim is that literacy teacher education programs aren't preparing teachers in the science of reading. And well, I think literacy teacher education programs are doing what they should be doing. They're emphasizing a broad swath of reading and learning science. They're reflecting the science of teacher development for how teachers learn how to support diverse learners. And what we really need to worry about is nurturing the knowledge needed to make situated and differentiated decisions to facilitate students' learning. That's what we should put our emphasis on. So there's that QR code again, and now we're going back to Rob. I'll leave it up for just a second while Rob gets ready. And now, Rob, I'm going to stop sharing so that you can take it over again.
Okay. Well, it's so interesting to try to understand the science of reading. We were, in a sense, befuddled by the extent to which our respected colleagues who were making these sorts of claims. And it wasn't until we sort of dug into the history of the work in this area that we finally discovered why they were making the claims that they were claiming. And it really related to what we called what counts as reading. And a key article we found was an article done by Keith Rayner and his colleagues, which included Barbara Foreman and Charles Perfetti and Mark Seidenberg and some others, in which they really narrowly defined reading as the ability to identify and understand the printed word and relate it to spoken language. Now, from our perspective, that's a pretty narrow definition. What they also did was separate it from what they identified as literacy. They said, surely literacy involves sociocultural and other sorts of dimensions of what we would consider to be reading, but we don't want our efforts to define reading to actually address those issues. We find that very, very interesting, and a key assumption by which you begin to understand where the science of reading folk are coming from. Now, from an educator perspective, it also makes you realize, wow, if that's how they're approaching reading, that's not necessarily what should match what I consider should be the types of things that are occurring in classroom. And those types of things, I think, are better formulated by looking at other definitions, such as the proposed 2026 NAEP definition, that really gets into looking at reading comprehension, meaning making, the connection of reading to the real world, and also reading not only from the perspective of reading text, but also digital or media-based reading. So when we thought about it, we said, wow, it really constrained reading to the simple view, which David has talked about. They really might claim that they represent a cognitive view, but that cognitive view is again narrowly defined in terms of at a word level identification, doesn't address socio-cognitive types of visual issues that really have fueled our understanding of how reading developments, not only individually, but in concert with, going back to Vygotsky and sort of the work of Ann Dyson and other things, nor have they really dealt with media and the multimodality, the social media types of issues that constitute reading in the real world, let alone the work in multilingualism, bilingualism, relating to translanguaging and plural literacies. So what's interesting is that we think to some extent, these colleagues of ours who are doing the science of reading have sort of said, well, these are the terms that we want to discuss in terms of reading. That's fine, but it becomes a problem if in fact they begin to define the mandates or begin to define how everybody is to view reading. Indeed, in Phil Goff, who's basically the primary author for the simple view of reading, even he talks about that reading is much more complex than just the phonic processes. And Mark Seidenberg, whose work has been sort of foundational to the science reading, he also talks about being careful not to narrow reading so that the emphasis is solely on phonics. So from our perspective, we think, in a sense, we want to go to a view of reading which fits a little bit more with what came out with the report done by the Center for the Study of Reading Folk, where they talked about reading being a sort of form of orchestration, where they compared it to the performance of a symphony orchestra. While it may be operating in a holistic fashion, it actually involves an orchestration, a coordination of a whole range of things to afford sort of meaning making using different sorts of cueing systems that might lead actually to more than one interpretation and so on. So let me pass it on to David again to not only discuss what I've talked about is what counts as reading, but also to talk about what should count as research. David?
Okay, thanks much, Rob, for that overview. And now here we go, back to mine. The next part of my presentation, hang on. There we go. I'm going to deal with the question, what is science? And the reason I'm dealing with it is that what made this current round of pushes for a kind of a return to foundational skills different from previous times is using the mantle of science and saying that the science is settled. We know what's going on. Well, we don't understand that because we've looked at what scientists say about science, and we don't think that the idea of settled science makes much sense at all. I looked up this in the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering. This is the sort of the Bible on science standards for K-12 schools. And it says that science is a self-improving process. The notion that there's a single scientific method of observation it makes no sense. Scientists do a lot of things. They do deductive reasoning, but they also, are out there searching for patterns. They classify things. They make generalizations from repeated observations, and they do a lot of inference making as to what might be the best explanation of what they observe. Thus, the picture of scientific reason is complicated, it's diverse, and it's certainly not linear and unitary. And one of the things that all scientists understand is that when you go out and you start looking at things carefully, you need to be prepared to be surprised. Our colleagues, Ranking, Ruby, and Risco, characterize the notion of settled science as an oxymoron. Why? Because science is always provisional, awaiting revision. Your science is only as good as your next theoretical understanding or your next empirical finding. And nowhere was this more vividly represented than in our COVID era. Remember that Tony Fauci would come onto the news and he would say, well, we thought it was going to go this way, but it's going this way, and we have to sort of revise our hypothesis. Well, what were they doing? Their science was as good as their latest set of data, and as the data changed, they had to change their explanations, and that meant that their theory changed. But they always followed the evidence, and they let evidence triumph over ideology and prompt revisions in their theoretical explanations of why COVID was spreading the way it's spreading and the like. So it's provisional, and revision is the norm. It's modest enterprise bounded by evidence and reason. And scientists are inherently skeptical. They ask, where's your data? What's your theory? What's the setting in which you did the research? And one of the things that scientists want to do is to keep the rest of us from overgeneralizing from their scientific studies and the like. And so we think that this is a real problem in the science of breeding, because when people use the uh, mixed evidence that comes from the science of breeding to set state mandates and new policies, they've gone beyond the license provided by the evidence. Another point about science is, despite the impulse to generalize, research doesn't get applied everywhere at once. It gets applied in specific settings, and that always introduces variability. Rob and I looked at medicine for a model, and one of the things we found is that there's a new branch of medicine called situated medicine. And what it does is it looks for cultural and individual variability to guide exceptions to the norm. Now, scientists still go with their evidence, but they're always looking for what might cause me to think that the best practice available according to the research isn't going to apply in this situation. Education respects individual and cultural differences as well. That's what the IEP and special ed is all about. Each kid is an exception to the norm in a sense. And it seems to me that the entire enterprise of culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogy is all about ensuring that you tailor the instruction as individually as you can, taking into account all of the resources that the kid brings to the table. In a sense, I want to also argue that research isn't done until practitioners close the loop begun by scientists when they started looking for what improves practice, because they have to make it happen inside the classroom. And when they do, they learn that things don't always work the way that people said they were going to work. And basically, what they do then is to start a new loop for researchers to take into account. So it's kind of a research into practice into research kind of cycle. But I want to say, if we want the option as teachers of exercising prerogative in the classroom to make sure we respond to the needs of individuals and groups, then there's a professional quid pro quo that we have to engage in. And the bargain is that if society is going to offer us prerogative to make decisions that are tailored to our situation, then we have to know as much as we can know so that we can respond to the variability we encounter in principled ways. And by the way, we don't know enough about exactly how this happens, but there's a whole new field of research that's on the horizon that I think is wonderful, and it's called improvement science. And what it's about is studying how it is that new ideas take hold inside of schools and classrooms, and just studying what has to be done to make that happen. And I can tell you one of the beautiful things about improvement science is that it's very client-centered in the sense that it understands that teachers, if they're the ones to be improving, have to be a part of the guidance of the projects and the like. Science is also multi-methodological. It's you got to have a full toolbox if you're going to study all these things out there in the world. Sure, we're going to do experiments, but they're the last step along the way that entails close observation, examining what goes with what, looking at the correlation between different things in school settings. Does phonemic awareness correlate with later word reading? Does it correlate with comprehension? And there's a new kind of research that's being done in schools called design-based research, where teachers and researchers work together to design something, revise it, try it out, then go back to the drawing boards and redesign it and the like. And my argument is that what we have in science is a complementarity, not a competition, where we want a full toolbox and a time for every approach to do its job. We also want to make sure we don't ask research methods to carry burdens they weren't designed to carry. Experiments are good for evaluating overall effects, but they don't unearth the active ingredients that make a classroom hum. And we shouldn't ask ethnographies to form the basis of public policy evaluations. You don't ask data mining expeditions like looking at scores on NAEP to yield causal explanations. And I think that the most important thing here is, in terms of research, is that when we want to make inferences about what is good practice, I think we need to require curricular and pedagogical that those kinds of policies be based on school-based experiments and ethnographies of what happens inside classrooms. The classroom is the crucible for settling those questions. And the other thing is that they're not just one science of reading. Edgar said at the beginning that we ought to have the sciences of reading. Those two issues of Reading Research Quarterly demonstrate that. And there's lots of places to look, I think, for these more comprehensive models of both reading development and also guides to curriculum and teaching. That's what Rob's going to talk about next in just a minute, if I will stop this. And then there's some articles that Rob and I have done as part of a book with Leslie Morrow, Ernest Morel, and Heather Casey that talks about this. And then there's, for those of you who teach really young readers, there's a new book by Donna Scanlon and her colleagues on early literacy, instruction, and intervention, where they talk a whole lot about not only foundational skills, but how you link foundational skills to outcomes like comprehension and making meaning. And also in our book and executive summary, we have lots of guidance here. Now back to Rob for an account of the science of teaching and learning reading.
Oops. Sorry, guys. I just want to pick up one thing that David said. One of the things that fascinates me about medicine is here you've got all this work leading to a sort of randomized trial comparing different treatments. But if you talk to a doctor about a condition you might have, you're going to hear frequently the response, every case will vary. And when you ask them for some more certainty, well, how will you know if I need changes or in a prescription or certain things? What they're likely to say is, well, we're going to observe you. We're going to keep close watch on you. And we're going to basically be observing you in different ways to make sure. And so I think we can learn from medicine that they don't lock themselves into a regimen, a one-size-fits-all for the patients. They approach it in a very case-based, situation-specific fashion, which is what I'd like to see happen with applying research, that recognize that the research is situation-based, and one has to check on the transferability, not so much the generalizability, the transferability to different situations. Well, let me talk a little bit more about learning, teaching, and testing. As you gather from my discussion of the definition of reading, I don't think how the science of reading is specifying what's involved in reading is enough. And last night, as I was thinking about one of these sort of 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, was thinking about today's presentation and thinking, well, should I present a sort of a better curriculum? And I thought, no, that's really not what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about our learners and what our learners need and what we're trying to do for our learners to help them become readers and writers and meaning makers in the context of dealing with images and print and whatnot. And so that what we really need to think about as we think about curriculum is first think about our learners and what we can help them in terms of their reading development, with the view that they actually may have different sort of profiles and that we as teachers need to adjust to how we support them. I do a lot of work in different parts of the world, such as Nigeria, in remote parts of Australia with some of the indigenous population. And what I find very frustrating is that the state government and the federal government, to some extent in Australia, for example, wants to basically legislate a single curriculum for all kids. And now, I don't care whether you're in a suburb of Sydney or a suburb of San Francisco or a remote area of Australia or different parts of the US or whatever. I think we have to think about our learners respectfully relative to the experiences that they have that we can build from, rather than sort of suggest there's a gap that they have to build to the curriculum we're imposing on them. So one of my key thoughts is, well, we really need to think about education relative to how do we bridge to learners, how do we motivate them, how do we engage them, how do we give them agency? And as we're doing that, not restrict ourselves just to reading the word, but how we might sort of pull together reading and writing, digital, inquiry, knowledge building, and comprehension and meaning making. And I'm sure there are other things. And to do that, we also need to be thinking about what we as teachers need to be. Reflective practitioners, cultural workers, and as David talked about, people involved in forms of design experiments. When David and I were working with a school in Illinois at one point, when we were working with teachers, trying to help them engage with their students better, what was an important shift that we made was to get them to stop thinking about how they change their practices to observing the students and how they could support the students doing the sorts of things that they need to do. In particular, one of the things we were focusing upon was comprehension. So how do we get kids engaged in activating their knowledge, looking at their knowledge and relating it to their reading? And so one of the things which we have tended to talk about is moving from a sort of a model that focuses on curriculum to a model that focuses upon the student, and a model that's not implementing a best practice, but a model that is focused upon a verb, best practicing, and avoiding some of the entrapments, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So when I think about what we need to do, I think we have to get back to the key question: how might we engage, motivate, and give our learners agency? And what I find the first thing is, how do we connect with their experiences? How do we avoid getting, as Vicky Purcell-Gates talked about, how do we avoid models that strip down reading and writing to technical skills, and rather, how do we actually connect with kids and their experiences through their reading? Very similar to Gloria Ladson's Billings culturally relevant pedagogy. And how do we do this in different sorts of ways? Not necessarily in the same sort of way. One of the groups I've been working with in China is in a science classroom Well, the teacher began this lesson with giving out kids mirrors and said, what questions do you have about mirrors? Notice what he did. He asked the students what questions they had. He didn't set the questions. And he had the students explore the issues rather than basically prescribing to them what they learned. As you know, they talked about in those, Gina Savetti and Freddie Ebert talked about knowledge building in a recent ILA webinar. And how do we engage kids in exploring their world and simultaneously we're doing reading and writing and looking at the world? How do we engage them in sort of looking, seeing, thinking, asking questions about their world? And how do we potentially engage them in activities which might not look like we're teaching reading, but in actuality, they have reading wrapped, all sorts of reading learnings wrapped around it, such as, you know, what happens when kids engage in reading and writing together. As David alluded to, an interesting article that just appeared was one that appeared in a British journal, where basically sort of claimed that I don't think it was so revolutionary myself, but they made the important point that there's a new double helix theory of teaching. And that is one that sort of connects reading and writing together and look for the complementarity that can occur through those things working together. And I guess the third area I wanted to mention was what's really missing from the science of reading is this approach to reading comprehension that places comprehension in a linear fashion, following word learning, rather than in an integrated sort of fashion, which contrasts very much from the advocacy coming out of Becoming a Nation reading, that reading is a process of constructing meanings, and that what we should be encouraging our kids to do simultaneously with reading is using meaning-making strategies. You know, using their knowledge, activating their background knowledge, setting purposes, predicting. And one of the things that Dave and I talk about in the book is when Ken Goodman used the term guessing game, he was as much talking about predicting or what's been identified in web-based studies as forward inferencing as anything. And unfortunately, people have sort of misconstrued what he was sort of suggesting in terms of that. So if we're going to move forward in terms of reading, we shouldn't just be focused upon reading the word. We also should be helping kids read the world. This sort of Freirean concept that the goal of reading should be both reading the word and the world. And that should involve meaning making across modes, which is sort of like what the kids experience today, whether being involved in their what would be today part of a classroom, video making, web-based exploration, social media, and so on. And such positions teachers in an interesting fashion. So what David and I have been talking a lot about is that the role of teachers is almost like what we would call an eco-pedagogue. They're cultural workers. They're designing community-based experiences with reading and writing. They're reflective practitioners and researchers. And that the concept that, again, we bring forward is this concept of not so much best practice, but a concept of best practicing, which aligns itself with a sort of ongoing research exploration to science studies that David's talking about in terms of science. Now, what I haven't dealt with is, in conjunction with all of this, what we also need to do is to recognize that some of the stuff we're using in the first and second grade is pretty lousy forms of assessment, poor measures of the sub-skill measures that are poor practices for reading development. Hence, they don't necessarily correlate with the sort of measures that begin to appear in the third and fourth grade. And what we need to be thinking about helping teachers do is observe kids and pursuing assessments that are organic, ongoing, and that assessments that help teachers teach and students learn. Here, I think things like the portfolio are ways of engaging teachers and students together in an observational fashion whereby they're actually building upon the reading and writing experiences and other activities that kids are involved in, and using those sessions as a means of sort of planning next steps relative to reading development. In a sense, I guess I want to just mention a vignette that Chris Gutierrez offered, which I thought was really powerful. Chris talks about in one of her articles that she was invited to the school to talk about her son. This is in the LA area, by the way. And she was a little chagrined about going there, but she did go, and she was confronted by a teacher who says, well, I'm really worried about your son. He's really struggling in reading. And Chris knew that his kid loved to read and read lots of books. And so Chris asked the question, well, what do you mean? I think he's a pretty good reader. And the teacher said, yeah, he's a good reader, but he has trouble dealing with the phonics worksheets. So what I think one has to be very careful is that if we keep our eyes on preparing the reader, and not so much the systems that they have to navigate that may or may not coincide with the developing reader's needs. I think that's a real key thing. That is one of the things that one can find themselves entrapped in, particularly if in fact the legislation or the mandates coming from the science reading are oppressing teachers and not giving teachers that license to be involved in best practicing based upon their observations of students and their case-based organic approaches to teaching and learning. Let me pass it on to David again.
Thanks so much, Rob. Okay, here we go. Whoops, I went too far. Okay. My last thing I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about research that we might do to help get us out of this morass that we find ourselves in. But I just wanted to put a period on what Rob had to say. When we've been looking at curriculum and teaching techniques and what it is that we want in a curriculum, and we can't use the word balanced anymore because it's been banned from our lexicon, even though I found it a perfectly fine term that I was very upset when people said it was now a swear word that would incite riots in the literacy field. We have chosen the word complementary literacy, and this is in one of our books. But these are the characteristics it should have. It should be comprehensive, ensuring that we don't leave anything out that's important. And I think Rob gave you a kind of a preview of what has to be included in that comprehensive curriculum. It's got to be nimble, and he talked about that too in terms of being able to adapt to circumstances. And those circumstances shift not only for students, they shift across time, tasks, students, and cultural settings. It has to be authentic in promoting real reading with real text and real settings, rather than the narrow band of reading characteristics of atypical settings, such as taking tests or completing test prep worksheets or many of the decodable texts I see. And it has to be fulfilling, and that is, it engages students, it promotes their agency, their identity, their knowledge, and above all, their well-being. I just want to raise a few issues for research that we still need to do. The first one, and the most important one, and we know that Barbara and Joe will have much to say about this when they respond, is how does everything we've discussed interact with second language development and cultural funds of knowledge? Some people are out there claim that the patterns generalize across language learning settings and groups and the like, and others argue for the particularity of settings. I don't think we have the final word on this, and I think that's going to be an area of research that we really need to push hard on. Secondly, I want to go back. I want to find out what it is that the three QA systems really do. Do they have a place in both reading theory and pedagogy? I think they do. The evidence that I've seen implicates all of them. Kids who use more cues have and expect decoding to vary by situation and circumstance, become good readers. I also want to know if there's still a role for the simple view of reading or whether it's time to move on. It is a convenient thing. If you think of it, the view as simple and not reading as simple, it's a lot more easier to accept.
Dr. Pearson, sorry to interrupt. Can you share your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sharing it.
No,
Oh,
Thank you.
we didn't see your slides, David.
I thought I was sharing it. Sorry.
Uh,
Thanks for interrupting me. Okay. Can you see it now? Yeah, it
Yes.
says I'm sharing it. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so for those of you who missed what I was saying, I apologize for that, but here they were. Yes, that was the first one. Comprehensive, nimble, authentic, and fulfilling. This is, you know, two kinds of research I wanted to see. And I was just going to talk about this, and that is there's two different models for skill development. There's an assembly line model where you go along and you pick up skills along the way, and we've seen a lot of that. And in a lot of what I've seen about structured literacy, I see a lot of that going on. And then there's the orchestra metaphor that Rog talked about. And what this one says is that at every stage along the way, whether you're in kindergarten or graduate school, you have to orchestrate a whole bunch of factors: the text, the task, your knowledge, your purpose, your motivation, and the like. And all those factors are important at every stage along the way. And what changes over time is the level of sophistication that you have in taking into account all those factors and making them turn out in a harmonious way. And I don't think what the final word is on which those models we really need. For example, can an emphasis on higher order processes like comprehension and composition enhance growth on decoding and word learning? There's some evidence to this, and if there is, it's an evidence for indirect as well as direct instruction, and that is, it's what Mark Seidenberg calls statistical learning, inferring patterns from repeated experience. Phonemic awareness is a great example. Before we had phonemic awareness instruction, kids developed phonemic awareness, not because we taught it directly, but because they learned it in the process of learning to read and particularly learning to spell. There's some evidence, for example, showing that when kids acquire word meanings, it actually enhances their decoding. So an emphasis on meaning can actually reach down and pull up a lower level skill. We still have a lot to learn about text. I saw a study recently by Freddie Hebert and her colleagues, a kind of a meta-analysis, where they said that there was, credible evidence for a balanced diet of decodable, predictable, and well-structured texts, and that was better than any of them alone. I still want to know whether there's a viable role for decodable text because uh, our research up to now has not been very kind to decodable texts. It doesn't show up even the meta-analysis by people who would like to see it show up can't say too much about it. Another thing I want to know, and we've never studied this has always been one thing I wanted to study. So if you're looking for a dissertation project, here's a great one. When kids go through schools, do they acquire schemas for our pedagogy? And reason I say that is that when I look in materials at the 14th lesson on a letter sound, it looks just like the first one or the second one. But I bet kids actually do learn a schema for how letter sound lessons work. And at some point you could say, no, this is just like what we did for S, only it's for the letter J or the like. Not sure I know about that. And the final two questions are these. How can we assure that pedagogical and implementation research is as well theorized and funded as basic research? I'm all for basic research. I love it. I love all those fMRI studies and eye movement studies. But I also am very worried that as a society, we don't spend enough looking at the research that will tell us more about pedagogy and learning. What knowledge about reading theory, research, and practice do teachers need at various stages of their careers? And how can we enact a model of continuous development for teachers? I've been in this field 50 years, and we started with that question when I came into the field, and we still have it. And we've made attempts to it. We've cozied up to it, but we've never asked the question of whether or not there's a trajectory of knowledge in terms of the level of sophistication of the knowledge teachers acquire. So back to Rob for some final thoughts.
David, can you stop sharing?
Yes. Yeah, right.
So I just wanted to mention just what I think are 3 entrapments that we have to avoid. And in a sense, I'm repeating what I've said, is one of the entrapments we have to avoid is losing a focus on the learner. And that can easily be lost by preset curriculum, scripted resources, and test scores. I think you can just talk to some of the organizations in California that sort of lament what happened when I won't mention the program that was adopted here, but where teachers felt that the program was oppressive. And what you're really looking for are programs that give teachers a license to focus on the learner in ways that are situation-based, in ways that respects the learner and builds upon what is we know is one of the key factors in comprehension, at least, is getting the kids to engage their background knowledge, their purposes, their ability to make predictions. Indeed, I remember way back when one of the best ways to assess whether a child can actually read something that might be considered more difficult is if he's capable of making, or she's capable of making predictions. I think another entrapment is assuming one size fits all versus adjusting to the needs of different students. The one dominant effect that we mention in our report is treatment by ability interaction. Most educational endeavors don't yield the same results for all students in all situations. The results vary by treatment and by the situation they're coming from, by abilities and all sorts of other things. And my last entrapment is, my goodness, what's so unfortunate right now is the extent to which some of our foundations, even the World Bank, advocating for use of fairly limited, or not fairly limited, quite limited measures of reading ability, whether it be DIBELS in Africa, EGRA, which aren't really providing, I think, adequate measures of reading development. And what I would love to see developed are better measures, giving teachers license to trust the measures that they incorporate in their classroom, but also even better, a better repertoire of measures that might be available by which educators can look at really what's going on. The things that are included in these on fluency, on reading comprehension in these things like DIBELS, from my perspective, really have questionable validity. And so I think I wanted to sort of mention those things as entrapments, which are sometimes related to the mandates, because sometimes these things are sort of, in a sense, sort of the fine print, maybe not even the fine print of what's legislatively mandated. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. David, you want to say a few words before we pass it back to?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. You want to thank you for letting go? Sure. I just have a few comments toward the end too. What I wanted to say was that I think that we have a long way to go in terms of how we interact with one another in order to solve the problems that face us. Can you see my screen, Rob? Yeah.
Yep.
Do I? Yeah.
Good.
I think we need to reset on how to manage our differences, our controversies, and our deeply held beliefs and our quest for common ground. We spend a lot of time not just in education, but in America, engaging in false debates where we don't let people speak for themselves. We say what they We say what we think they mean, and then we critique our account of what we think they believe. And we got to replace those with real debates where people speak for themselves. And we've got to, and we've got to listen to people who don't think and believe just like we do. I think it's time for a reset on the National Reading Panel of the late 1990s. But if we do it again, we have to have a broader representation of contributors, people from different research methodologies and epistemologies. I think we even need an international reading panel. And I think we need the full range of constituencies involved, including lots more teachers and even parents and the like. We could engage in a parallel level at the local level where we might have gatherings. Rob calls them learning nests, where people get together, plan their own design studies, and then work with one another to refine and tailor those. And above all, I think we must look beyond our differences, stay at the table, exhaust all possibilities for consensus, and then find ways to design research, not rhetoric, to settle our differences. I want to close by saying that above all, and putting the emphasis where Rob did, one of the things we know about kids is they are who they are. They know what they know, and they bring what they bring. And wishing that they knew something more or something different won't make it so. And I think our job as teachers is to help them transform what they bring, both individually and collectively, into curricular resources that benefit not only them, but their classmates. And regard those as curricular resources rather than instructional inconveniences. Differences are part of our treasures. We can do this only if we hold high expectations for all students, convey great respect for the knowledge and culture they bring to the classrooms, and offer unwavering support for helping them achieve the expectations we have. I don't think any goal could be more important for those of us who aspire to make a difference in the lives of students, their families, and their teachers. And no accomplishment, I think, could be more important for our nations, its families, and above all, its children. And I wanted to close by saying, thank you, our audience, for being who you are, for knowing what you know, for bringing what you bring, and above all, for doing what you do. And now it's back to our hosts.
Dr. Lampkin?
Yes, are we gonna have any comments from our panelists?
Yes, I have several comments. Yes, first of all, thank you so much for all of this insight. A few of the highlights. The concept of eco-pedagogists, something that I just, that really speaks to me, because one of the arguments that we have in terms of multilingual learners is that we are coming from a very broad and comprehensive transdisciplinary knowledge base in terms of the pedagogy for multilingual learners. And I have used the metaphor of that being like an ecosystem, that if you start damming off streams of knowledge so that it doesn't get into the ecosystem of the lake and its tributaries, then you're narrowing the knowledge that we have for applying pedagogy. And Dr. Pearson, I'm so glad you asked about the 3 cueing systems and the simple view of reading, because that's where I'd like to comment. Because with the concept of moving beyond mandates, we need to also move beyond bans. We should not be jumping on the bandwagon, spelled B-A-N-N-E-D. And because the bans on instructional practices or strategies are interfering in teachers' classrooms in a way that I think is unprecedented and totally unnecessary. And I think as a research community, we can reasonably expect that if we're going to have evidence-based practices, that a ban on any particular practice should also be evidence-based. And the problem with the ban on 3Qing system at times, or systems, is that there's no empirical evidence to suggest or to support the notion that any of the subsystems of language, phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, that is necessary for understanding and producing oral language would not be necessary for comprehending reading. And in fact, the research into the simple view of reading from the perspective of multilingual learners shows that most of the variance in comprehension for second language learners reading in their second language is due to their knowledge, their level of knowledge of second language grammar. That's 72% of the variance in one study, and their knowledge of the vocabulary in their second language. So that means that when we look at the simple view of reading, the role of decoding in terms of the variance in comprehension scores is not that great as compared to these features of the second language. And in fact, the 3Qing systems concept, I think, derives from the 3 categories of miscues that Goodman and his colleagues, including Dr. Flores, identified, where they could identify a possible origin of a miscue, which was basically the difference between what the text actually said and the language that the child produced while reading. And in making bans against 3Qing, sometimes it's against, you're banned from teaching syntax, or you're banned from teaching context, for example, and phonographing, that miscuing never gets banned, right? Because that's phonics. But morphology doesn't get banned very often because that's at the word level. But anyway, the banning of these ways of making the reader aware of where they might be misinterpreting the text, or the knowledge of language that they're lacking to identify a word, is basically anathema in terms of the metalinguistic approach to instruction, which is based on how language works. And the fact is that we have ways in which every language works the same, and then we have language-specific differences in a language. And that's what a second language learner is learning grammar in the second language. They're learning vocabulary. And if they can't learn through reading and build their vocabulary that way, or if they can't be having that awareness of grammar, syntax, etc., made explicit while they're interacting with the teacher during reading, then we're losing opportunities, especially for second language learners, to expand their reading comprehension and their vocabulary and grammatical control of the second language. So those intertwining claims need to be addressed by showing what research we have in second language acquisition, second language reading, metalinguistic transfer facilitation, all of those other areas and trends in our research base for multilingual learners.
Thank you, Dr. Mora. And for those of you that may not be aware or may not know Dr. Barbara Flores, she is also a scholar and a researcher and a developer of pedagogy in literacy and biliteracy. And so I'm interested in hearing from you because also you have developed children's literature. And one of the things I've heard you say is that teaching reading through writing is also a vehicle. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and make some connections to what we've heard in regards to some of the claims, Dr. Flores?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lumpkin. First of all, David and Rob, thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about. And also, your, how would you say, your inquiry of the claims is just so robust. And then offering, ways that we can move forward without mandates is really, really key. Also examining, what I saw were three things. A teacher agency. I spent 40 years as a teacher educator in classrooms. And it was unpopular, David or Rob, to do action research in the teaching, learning, and examining the pedagogy that teachers were engaged in. There were some studies that people did engage in, but I think you're just right on that that's what we need to go. There's where we need to go. That's the type of research that needs to be funded. And and I even would ask the kids, well, what did you think? Did we do a okay job? Is it helping you besides just the teachers and the the teacher educator researcher creating pedagogy? And it says, questioning, well, it says this here in theory, how does it look like in practice? How are we going to organize it or create it? Those are the types of questions. And like you said at the end, David and Rob, that we have to engage our teachers and parents and community. So I think you called it case-based organic teaching learning, Rob. And then I also think that what you call to action, David, in terms of the new reading panel, where we do include all the aspects that you said, all the different epistemologies, all the different people at the table, and more teachers at the table as well, across the nation and even internationally, Rob, in your work with a variety of nations throughout the world. I just wanted to also add to what Jill said that a recent study or framework by the Council of Great Cities Schools is a framework for foundational literacy skills instruction for English learners. It was spring of 2023. Also focuses on the complexity of learning, teaching learning related to literacy, reading, writing, oral language development. And so there's so much research that isn't included. And I love what you said. There are many sciences of reading and also writing and content knowledge as well. And that we have to be more inclusive. And so I just want to thank you so much. If you'd like to respond to what Jill said and what I said, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, Rob, you want to go ahead?
Sure, let me make sure. Am I? No, I'm not on mute. Yeah, I was real interested in what you said, Jill, particularly related to the queuing system. And I think as David sort of talked about the sort of the banning of balanced literacy, the banning of Marie Clay and people like that. And here you've got and the failure to pay attention to Donna Scanlon's work, which really looked at engaging kids in using multiple queuing systems, and which was able to clearly demonstrate the advantages in terms of their reading development. And Marie Clay in her work, and the strategy she engaged in, where she got kids to debrief, which fits in with what Barbara was talking about, what their strategies were to do a sort of a form of cross-checking. And Yetta Goodman stuff, where she also had kids, in a sense, look at their own miscues as a way of learning about how to learn,
Right.
which I thought was
Absolutely.
so important. I do think one of the developments that I have seen that's occurring that might be beneficial, depending upon the quality of the people that are enlisted, is giving teachers the opportunity to work with coaches. It's interesting, in China, they have mandated that teachers get together and collaborate and discuss what's going on in their classrooms.
Mhm.
This is what David and I were talking about, is at the school level, having, in a sense, like learning nests where teachers get a chance to explore issues and debrief with one another, and talk about what they want to try. And that example I showed from China with the teachers with the mirrors, that sort of happened like that. I sort of challenged the teacher. I said, why don't you give the kids a chance to set their own purposes? And he just said, well, I'm a science teacher. Surely I can pursue that as an interesting question for me to find answers to in my classroom, because surely science is about the asking of questions, and to help my kids is to get them to ask questions. And so when the people from the Beijing municipal schools sort of said, well, aren't you worried that they don't learn the most important thing? He said to them, well, the most important thing for kids who are in science classes to learn is to learn to ask their own questions. And so anyhow, so thank you, both of you guys, for your very kind comments. And I think there's a lot out there that David talked about. We need further research on the queuing system, and making people aware that the banning of the queuing systems just seems like out of left field, or whatever they say in baseball.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
not a big fan of mandates. Every time I've tried to do something with people where they've been mandated to do something, I found that resistance rather than acceptance has been the norm. That people, people in professions don't like to have mandates crammed down their throats or the like. And my first boss out of college, I worked for Macy's in the complaint department, and my boss said, one of the things you got to remember in this job is you can catch more bees with honey than you can with vinegar. And so that, you
I
and I've
want,
never forgotten that. And there's a sense in which I don't. One of the things I don't understand is the models of teacher learning that are implicit in a lot of the professional development I see associated with the science of reading. It's like they assume that if you just hire the hall and tell people what to do and then check up on them and see if they've done it, that they'll do it. What could be farther from the truth? Uh, uh, people have to, people have agency. You wouldn't even want people who didn't have agency in the teaching profession. And what you want are people who will talk back to you, and people who will negotiate with you, and people who will figure out, well, we can do this, but we can't do that, or and we'll make it work in this situation. You want that sort of give and take in it, so it shouldn't be mandated. There's I think just a mandate's a surefire recipe for failure, and and uh, I find it ironic, and this happened in No Child Left Behind. We delivered a lot of professional development to people about the science of teaching kids using approaches to adult learning that that flew in the face of everything we knew about adult learning. You know, uh, I don't understand it at all. Uh, and if people say, "Well, we can't afford that," uh, you know, uh, as a society, we can afford to do a lot of things about education if we have the will to do it. And spending the kind of resources and personal resources and the like on teacher professional learning would be a good start on making a commitment that we really thought that teaching and learning in schools were important.
And I wanted to add about the Goodman's work of 60 years of research and developing miscue analysis. It wasn't a method, and it wasn't a teaching method. It was looking at how proficient readers read and documenting what were their behaviors. And so the three queuing systems method doesn't stem from them. It stems from, I believe, Jill, from Mari Clay and Reggie Routman. And that's fine. It's people develop pedagogy and give them names, for different things. And we have 60 years of research and miscue analysis and the EMMA studies, the eye movement studies throughout the world, and many different languages that look at what a proficient reader does. And then we have the work of Emilia Ferreiro and Anna Taborowski that dared to ask the question, do children interpret written language differently than adults? And if they do, how do they interpret them? And they were Piagetians, and they did research in Argentina and in Mexico, and showed us the universality and named the constructivists how kids interpret written language. It's called psychogenesis. And I remember Ferreiro, asking Ferreiro, okay, so what does it look like in the classroom? She goes, I've done my work. I'm the theoretician. You're the pedagogue. You have to figure that out yourself. And I'm telling you how kids come to know. And now you have to, with teachers, figure out how you're going to, organize the teaching and learning of it. And that's what we have to do. We have to look at all the different aspects, just like you said, Rob, about science. How do we get kids to engage in, asking questions? I go to Vygotsky. Vygotsky says that knowledge is socially constructed through social interaction. So what are the types of social interaction that we're going to engage our kids in? What's the goal? What are the goals? And how do we, and I find it exciting, and we can't have mandates that limit us and narrow our ways of creating, along with teachers, ways of teaching learning. And anyway, those are my
I
comments.
just thought note that our time is running out, and I didn't want it to run out without thanking all the people who showed up today, because you're very important, and you've given us the most important gift you have, and that's the gift of your time and attention. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah. I just wanted to build something on what Barbara said. There are some things that I take heart with right now with some of the things happening with the science of reading. And it's sort of consistent with the fact that we were able to show that Phil Goff shifted his position or, changed. Mark Seidenberg seems to be changing his position. I think somehow they're opening themselves up to question. Likewise, I found with Ken Goodman. I was at Arizona at one point with Ken, and Ken would continue to ask questions. It wasn't like Ken was looking for a panacea. And I think the danger you have with the science of reading thing is that some people want to sort of grab it onto as a panacea, rather than as we've been trying to present today, science as being an ongoing sort of ongoing practice for teachers and students, and for those folks who are involved in research on reading. But I want to also echo what David said. Thank you so much, you guys from the California Association, who trust us enough to spend the time with us and give us this venue. So thank you.
One final comment. I'm committed to the science of reading, It's just that it's got to be a different science and somehow gets played out in the public press and in the blogs and social media.
CABE is committed to the sciences of reading, not the science of reading. And that is, I think, the reason why this webinar is so important, because, you know, another thing, thank you again, Dr. Tierney and Dr. Pearson. One of the things that you guys mentioned was the importance of coming together to have those dialogues, those discussions. The irony behind it is that here in California, that already happened. That is how we developed the ELA, ELD framework. That is how we realized that the research that is there supports literacy and biliteracy, and we need to use the sciences of reading in order to help us do the work in meeting the needs of our diverse group of students. And so the work continues. We want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope that you take the time to reflect on what has been shared. But if you need to come back, you're welcome to do that. On our website, we will have this recording available for you. We encourage you to read the book, Fact-Checking the Science of Reading, Opening Up the Conversation. And today, especially for all of you that have hung in there all this time, we also have access for you to be able to take a look at the executive summary of Fact-Checking the Science of Reading. It is actually not even hot off the press yet, but I want to thank Dr. Tierney and Dr. Pearson for giving us the opportunity to share that with the folks that are joining us today. And so please know that this webinar will be available. We will also be taking a look at your questions, just like we did with Stephen Strauss, and we will be having Dr. Tierney and Dr. Pearson respond to those questions. And all of that will be available and posted on our CABE website for you to be able to access and take a look at, and be able to come back and look at it again. Lots of resources there for you to take a look at and realize that there's still a lot of work that we need to do to ensure that people understand that the work in California has been done. We need to now focus on accessing those resources and those tools that are there and empowering our teachers by building their capacity in implementing the ELA, ELD framework and supporting literacy and biliteracy here in California. So thank you all once again. And Delma, I'll let you close it off.
Thank you, Dr. Lampkin. Yes, we hope you have enjoyed this presentation and that you will walk away very well informed and with a new or reinforced perspective. Want to remind you of if you have any questions, you can still submit your questions. There's the QR code. We have a few other announcements if you just stand by with us that you will be interested in hearing. We also want to let you know that today's webinar will be available on demand at gocabe.org on Friday, June 14th. No registration is required, so you can go on and look at that. Go to gocabe.org. And just continue to remind you that you can submit your questions. Please scan the QR code and your responses will be addressed. On June 24th, we should have a recording up at gocabe.org. We also will remind you of the book that you can take a look at literacyresearchcommons.org. Please make sure that you take a look at that. And just a reminder to download the Tierney and Pearson fact-checking chart with 3 versions of the SoR claims. That's the QR code. You could also download that, and that will be available also for you online. A few other announcements. CABE will be having our Summer Dual Language Education Institute, which will be at the San Diego Hilton Bayfront on July 1st to the 3rd. We still have room available. Please register to attend, and the QR code there. And if you don't get a chance to do the QR code, please visit us at gocabe.org, and we have a listing of our upcoming events happening on the right side of our website. So, just curious, anyone wants to go to Oaxaca? Well, we have if you're interested in attending the Intercultural Education Conference in Mexico, we are going to Oaxaca on June the 19th to the 23rd. If you're interested in attending, please click on the QR code or scan the QR code, or you can go to gocabe.org/Oaxaca 2024, and you can register to attend our first annual, shall we say, Intercultural Education Exchange in Oaxaca. Just a reminder, we want to make sure that you know that we appreciate you and we thank you for participating in this webinar. And once again, we will leave this out for any questions. You can still submit it, scan this QR code, and we will address those at a later date. Please check our website, June 14th, and we should have the recording of these questions addressed. Until then, we'll see you next time.